One court decision that could change your money right now. Something critical is happening in the background of the U.S. economy, and most Americans don't realize how directly it could affect their finances. A Supreme Court decision is pending, and depending on how the justices rule, it could reshape prices, jobs, and even the possibility of $2,000 rebate checks that many people are hoping for. At the center of this case are Trump-era tariffs, taxes placed on imported goods from other countries. For years, these tariffs have been a cornerstone of Donald Trump's economic strategy. The White House argued they were necessary to protect American workers, pressure foreign governments, and generate massive revenue for the U.S. government. But now, the legality of those tariffs is being questioned at the highest level. If the Supreme Court allows the tariffs to remain in place, the government continues collecting billions of dollars. If the court strikes them down, those tariffs could disappear overnight, and the government may be forced to refund huge sums of money already collected. Why does this matter to you? Because those same tariffs are directly tied to the idea of $2,000 checks for Americans. Trump has repeatedly suggested that tariff revenue could be returned to households as a kind of dividend or rebate. If the tariffs fall, that entire idea could collapse with them. For seniors and retirees already feeling squeezed by higher grocery prices, rising insurance costs, and fixed incomes that don't stretch as far as they used to, this ruling isn't just legal news. It's personal. One decision, two possible outcomes, and millions of Americans waiting to see which direction the economy turns. Trump's tariffs explained what they are and why they matter. To understand why this Supreme Court decision matters so much, we first need to clearly explain what Trump's tariffs actually are. At their core, tariffs are taxes placed on imported goods. When products come into the United States from other countries, those taxes are added at the border. During Donald Trump's presidency, tariffs became one of his most powerful economic tools. The administration often referred to many of these as Liberation Day tariffs. They were promoted as a way to protect American jobs, force fairer trade deals, and reduce dependence on foreign countries. And these were not small increases. There was a baseline 10% tariff on most imported goods, with much higher rates placed on certain countries. In some cases, tariffs reached 40 to 50%, particularly on imports from China, Mexico, and Canada. The White House argued these tariffs served multiple purposes, pressuring foreign governments to negotiate, protecting national security, and bringing large amounts of money into the U.S. Treasury. From a political standpoint, the message was simple. Tariffs would strengthen America and make the country richer. But behind that message is a critical detail that now sits before the Supreme Court. These tariffs were imposed using an old law from 1977, originally designed for true national emergencies. The question now is whether that law actually gave the president authority to impose such broad, long-term tariffs without Congress approving them. That legal uncertainty is exactly why this case exists. And depending on how the court answers that question, everything connected to these tariffs, including the talk of $2,000 checks, could change very quickly. The legal challenge. Why courts are questioning Trump's authority. The reason this case has reached the Supreme Court comes down to one critical issue: presidential authority. Donald Trump did not impose these tariffs through Congress. Instead, he relied on an old law passed in 1977, known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, often called IEEPA. That law was created for extreme situations, wars, terrorist threats, or true national emergencies. It allows a president to take swift economic action when the country faces immediate danger. But lower courts have questioned whether trade disputes qualify as that kind of emergency. In 2025, several federal courts ruled that Trump may have gone too far by using IEEPA to impose broad, long-term tariffs on entire countries without congressional approval. Judges argued that the law was never intended to give a president unlimited power over trade policy. However, and this part is important, those courts did not immediately remove the tariffs. Instead, they allowed the tariffs to remain in place temporarily while the administration appealed the decisions. That's why the money is still being collected today. Now the case sits with the Supreme Court. When the justices heard arguments late last year, legal experts noticed something unusual. The court appeared skeptical. Several justices questioned whether the emergency law truly applies here and whether Congress was improperly bypassed. The court did not issue a quick decision, and that silence has created uncertainty across the economy. For seniors watching this unfold, the takeaway is simple. The $2,000 check idea is standing on unsettled legal ground. If the court decides the president did not have this authority, the foundation of the entire tariff system could crack, and everything tied to it could be at risk. Economic uncertainty, how waiting on the court is affecting jobs and hiring. While the Supreme Court takes its time, the economy does not pause. In fact, the uncertainty itself is already doing damage, and it's showing up most clearly in the job market. Businesses hate uncertainty. When companies don't know what the rules will be next month, or even next week, they become cautious. They delay big decisions, they pull back on expansion, and most importantly, they stop hiring. That's exactly what has been happening. As the court case dragged on, job growth in 2025 slowed sharply. In fact, it became one of the weakest hiring years outside of a formal recession. Employers weren't laying people off in massive numbers, but they weren't adding new jobs either. By the end of the year, unemployment had crept up to around 4.4%. That number may not sound alarming at first glance, but economists pay close attention to trends, not just headlines. When unemployment rises during a period without a recession, it signals hesitation and fear, not collapse, but restraint. For older Americans, this slowdown has real consequences. Many seniors still work part-time to supplement retirement income. When hiring freezes hit, those opportunities disappear first. Hours get cut, temporary positions vanish, and finding replacement work becomes harder. Families supporting aging parents feel the pressure too, as fewer job opportunities ripple through the economy. This is how legal uncertainty quietly tightens financial conditions, not through dramatic crashes, but through hesitation that spreads decision by decision. And while jobs slowed, something else surprising happened with prices. Why inflation didn't explode and what Americans paid instead. When Trump's tariffs were first introduced, many economists warned of one major risk: runaway inflation. The logic seemed simple. If imported goods are taxed more heavily, prices should rise quickly across the economy. And at first, many Americans braced for exactly that. But something unexpected happened. Inflation did rise, but it did not explode the way many feared. Overall, inflation remained relatively controlled. There was no sudden surge that wiped out purchasing power overnight. On the surface, that sounded like good news. But the real story sits underneath the headline numbers. Certain prices did jump noticeably. Groceries like beef, coffee, tomatoes, and other imported food items became more expensive. Everyday goods quietly cost more, especially products tied to global supply chains. So why didn't inflation spiral out of control? Because many businesses chose to absorb the higher tariff costs themselves instead of passing them fully on to consumers. Companies accepted lower profit margins to stay competitive. Prices were raised, but only slightly. That decision came with a trade-off. Instead of sharp price increases, the economy paid in other ways: fewer jobs, slower expansion, and tighter business budgets. Hiring slowed. Raises became harder to come by. Growth plans were put on hold. For seniors, this trade-off is easy to miss, but hard to feel. Maybe prices didn't skyrocket overnight, but money still didn't stretch as far. Shopping trips felt tighter. Fixed incomes covered less, and any loss of part-time work hit harder than before. In other words, the pain didn't disappear. It simply shifted, and that shift leads directly to the question Americans keep asking. If households already paid more through higher prices and weaker job growth, what about the promised $2,000 check? The $2,000 check explained. Promise versus reality. This is the point in the story that gets the most attention. The $2,000 check. Donald Trump has repeatedly said that revenue from tariffs could be used to fund what he calls a dividend for the American people. Sometimes it's described as a rebate, other times as direct relief, but the headline number stays the same: $2,000 per person, excluding high-income earners. On the surface, it sounds simple. Tariffs bring in money. That money gets shared with households. Americans get relief. But when you look closer, the reality becomes far more complicated. The administration has claimed that tariff revenue could reach as high as $600 billion. That number is often used to support the argument that there is more than enough money to send checks. Independent analysts tell a different story. Most nonpartisan estimates put actual tariff revenue much lower, closer to $200 to $300 billion in a strong year. Still a significant amount, but nowhere near what's often implied. Now consider the cost. Sending a $2,000 check to every eligible American could cost around $450 billion. That means even under optimistic revenue assumptions, the math is tight. In weaker years, it simply doesn't work. And this calculation doesn't even include potential refunds, legal costs, or economic slowdowns caused by uncertainty. For seniors, this matters. The promise of a check feels reassuring, but the funding behind it leaves little margin for error. One legal ruling or one economic shift could collapse the entire plan, which leads to an even more important question. Who actually paid this tariff money in the first place? Because the answer to that question changes how this dividend should really be understood. Who really paid the tariffs? The hidden cost to American households. One of the most misunderstood claims in this entire debate is the idea that foreign countries pay for tariffs. In reality, that's not how tariffs work. Tariffs are first paid by U.S. importers, American companies that bring goods into the country. Those companies then face a choice: absorb the extra cost themselves or pass it on through higher prices. Over time, most of that cost ends up landing on American households. That means when tariffs increase, families quietly pay more at the grocery store, at hardware retailers, and for everyday goods that depend on global supply chains. The increases may not always be obvious, but they add up month after month. According to one estimate cited by economists, the average household effectively paid around $1,700 more in higher costs over the past year because of tariffs. Not in one bill, but through dozens of small price increases spread across daily life. This is why many experts push back against calling the $2,000 payment a dividend. From their perspective, it's not free money. It's closer to returning a portion of what people already paid indirectly through higher prices and reduced job opportunities. For seniors living on fixed incomes, this distinction matters deeply. When costs rise quietly, budgets tighten fast. A few extra dollars on food, utilities, or household goods can force painful trade-offs. So while a $2,000 check could offer short-term relief, it may simply offset pressure that's already been building for years. And this brings us to a critical risk. If the courts decide these tariffs were never legal to begin with, what happens to all that money? And what happens to the checks tied to it? If the Supreme Court strikes the tariffs, why the checks could vanish. Everything about the $2,000 check now hinges on one critical question. What will the Supreme Court decide? If the court rules against Trump's tariffs, the impact would be immediate and far more serious than many people realize. First, the tariffs themselves could be wiped out entirely. That would instantly shut off the revenue stream Trump says would fund the rebate checks. No tariffs means no ongoing money coming in. But the bigger shock comes next. If the court determines the tariffs were imposed without proper legal authority, the government could be forced to refund billions of dollars already collected. More than 1,000 companies are already lined up in court, waiting to demand their money back if the ruling goes that way. In that scenario, there would be no surplus revenue at all. Instead of money available for Americans, the government could be writing massive refund checks to corporations, and that would effectively end the $2,000 rebate idea, at least in the form it's been described. For seniors and retirees, this is a crucial point. It means the checks don't just depend on political promises or goodwill. They depend on a legal ruling that could erase the funding overnight. And unlike Congress, there is no negotiating with the Supreme Court. Once the decision is made, it's final. This is why economists and financial planners urge caution. When relief is tied to unsettled law, it can disappear instantly, without warning. And even if the court allows the tariffs to stand, there is still another major obstacle standing in the way of those checks: Congress itself. Why legal experts say Congress still controls the money. Even if the Supreme Court ultimately allows Trump's tariffs to remain in place, there is still another major barrier standing between Americans and a $2,000 check: Congress. Most legal and financial experts agree on this point. Sending money directly to civilians usually requires congressional approval. Under the U.S. Constitution, Congress holds the power of the purse. That means lawmakers, not the president, decide how federal money is spent. This principle has guided every major relief program in modern history. Supporters of the tariff dividend argue that this situation is different. They claim tariffs are imposed by the executive branch, so the revenue should fall under presidential control. Legal scholars strongly dispute that interpretation. They point out that collecting money and distributing money are two very different actions. Even if tariffs are legally imposed by the president, redirecting that money into checks for millions of Americans would almost certainly be viewed as a new spending program, one that requires Congress to authorize it. There has been one exception often cited: special warrior dividend payments sent to service members. But those payments were funded using defense money that Congress had already approved. The authority already existed. The proposed civilian rebate does not have that backing. A bill known as the American Worker Rebate Act was introduced to address this issue, but it remains stalled. No vote, no timeline, and no clear path forward. Some senators, including Republicans, have openly criticized the idea, arguing tariff revenue should be used to reduce the national debt instead of sending checks. So even if the tariffs survive the courts, the legal road to $2,000 checks remains narrow, uncertain, and politically contested. Political resistance on both sides. Why this plan keeps stalling. Beyond the courts and legal arguments, there is another major reason the $2,000 check remains uncertain: political resistance from both parties. While the idea of sending money to Americans is popular with voters, support inside Washington is far from unified. On the Republican side, several senators, including some aligned with fiscal conservatives, have openly criticized the proposal. Their concern is not whether Americans are struggling, it's about priorities. They argue that tariff revenue should be used to reduce the national debt, not sent out as direct payments. With interest costs on the debt rising rapidly, they warn that distributing hundreds of billions of dollars could weaken the country's long-term financial position. For them, the question is not relief versus no relief, it's short-term help versus long-term stability. Democrats, meanwhile, are divided for different reasons. Many support direct payments in principle, especially given rising living costs, but they are deeply skeptical of any program controlled entirely by the executive branch. They argue that without congressional oversight, the checks could lack transparency, clear eligibility rules, and accountability. This split creates gridlock. A proposed solution, the American Worker Rebate Act, was meant to establish a legal framework for payments. But the bill has stalled. No vote has been scheduled. No agreement has been reached. For seniors watching this unfold, the pattern feels familiar. Big ideas make headlines. Political disagreements slow progress, and uncertainty drags on. Until lawmakers resolve these conflicts, the $2,000 check remains stuck, talked about, debated, but not delivered. Falling confidence. How uncertainty is affecting everyday Americans. One of the most powerful forces in the economy right now isn't interest rates or stock prices. It's confidence, and it's been quietly slipping. When people don't know what's coming next, they change how they behave, they spend less, they delay decisions, they hold back, not because they want to, but because uncertainty feels risky. That's exactly what this ongoing tariff and court battle has created. Americans are hearing mixed signals. On one hand, there's talk of $2,000 checks and tariff dividends. On the other hand, there are legal challenges, political resistance, and warnings that the money may never materialize. That uncertainty has a psychological cost. Consumer confidence has dropped. People feel stretched. Groceries cost more than they used to. Insurance premiums are higher. Rent remains elevated. And for retirees living on fixed incomes, every increase feels heavier because there's no easy way to earn more. For many seniors, the idea of a $2,000 check feels like hope. Even if it's uncertain, it represents relief, a chance to catch up, to breathe, to feel less behind. But uncertainty cuts both ways. When people don't know whether help is actually coming, anxiety rises instead of falling. Households hesitate to make plans. They don't know whether to prepare for relief or brace for disappointment. That hesitation feeds back into the economy. Lower confidence leads to slower spending. Slower spending makes businesses even more cautious. And that caution reinforces the slowdown we're already seeing. So even before the Supreme Court rules, the uncertainty itself is already shaping behavior, quietly, steadily, and deeply. Which brings us to a critical reality check. What should people do right now before any decision is made? A reality check. Why you shouldn't count on the $2,000 yet. With all the headlines, debates, and speculation, This is the moment where a clear reality check is needed. As of right now, there is no approved plan for $2,000 checks. There is no scheduled payment date, and there is no guarantee that this money will ever be sent. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does mean it should not be part of your financial planning. The checks depend on several major factors all lining up at the same time. Tariffs must remain in place. The Supreme Court must rule in favor of the administration. Congress must either approve the payments or decline to block them, and the financial math must actually work. That is a lot of uncertainty resting on one promise. For seniors and retirees, counting on money that hasn't been authorized can be risky. Bills don't wait, medical needs don't pause, groceries and utilities still have to be paid every month, regardless of what happens in Washington. Financial experts consistently give the same advice in situations like this. If unexpected money arrives, treat it as a bonus, not a guarantee. Don't delay paying bills. Don't take on new debt assuming help is coming. And don't make large purchases based on political timelines. Many Americans have been hurt in the past by waiting on promised relief that arrived late or never arrived at all. Understanding this doesn't mean giving up hope. It means protecting yourself while staying informed. And that brings us to the final stretch of this story, what all of this means long-term, and what Americans should be watching next. What the Supreme Court decision could mean for the economy. The Supreme Court's upcoming decision is about much more than tariffs or rebate checks. It could reshape the direction of the entire economy. If the court rules in favor of keeping Trump's tariffs in place, one major source of uncertainty disappears overnight. Businesses would finally know the rules. Investment plans that have been sitting on hold could restart. Hiring could slowly pick up again. For everyday Americans, that kind of clarity matters. Even without a $2,000 check, a more stable business environment could mean better job prospects, steadier hours, and less fear of sudden economic shocks. For seniors, it could also mean less pressure on family members who are still working and supporting them. But the opposite ruling carries its own risks. If the court strikes down the tariffs, markets could react quickly. Companies that paid billions in tariffs may demand refunds. That could strain government finances and increase pressure on interest rates. In the short term, financial markets could swing sharply as investors adjust to the new reality. There is also the possibility of renewed trade conflict. Even if Trump loses this case, he could attempt to reimpose tariffs using different legal authority. Congress has passed other trade laws that allow tariffs under specific conditions. That process would be slower and more limited, but it wouldn't necessarily mean the end of tariffs altogether. In other words, no outcome is perfectly clean. What the court decides won't just affect checks or headlines. It will affect confidence, planning, and stability across the economy. And for Americans watching from home, especially those already stretched financially, this decision represents a turning point, not because it guarantees relief, but because it may finally bring clarity. Final warnings. Why financial decisions should be based on facts, not promises. As this debate continues, one message needs to be stated clearly and without drama. Financial decisions should be based on confirmed facts, not political promises. That doesn't mean promises are always empty. But history shows they are often delayed, changed, or blocked entirely by forces outside any one person's control. The proposed $2,000 check is a perfect example. Right now, it depends on a Supreme Court ruling that hasn't happened yet. It depends on tariff revenue that may or may not continue, and it depends on political cooperation that so far has not materialized. That combination makes this money highly uncertain. For seniors and retirees, this uncertainty carries real risk. Fixed incomes don't leave room for assumptions. Delaying bills, postponing medical care, or making large purchases based on money that isn't guaranteed can quickly create long-term problems. Financial planners consistently advise against spending tomorrow's money today, especially when that money has not been approved or scheduled. The safest approach is simple. Assume the check is not coming. Plan your budget based on what you already have. Treat any future payment as a bonus, not a solution. This doesn't mean ignoring the story. It means watching it carefully and realistically. Look for concrete actions, court rulings, signed laws, official announcements, not interviews or speculation. When real relief happens, it won't arrive quietly. It will come with paperwork, clear guidance, and confirmation. Until then, protecting your financial stability matters more than chasing hopeful headlines. And that leads us to the final piece of this discussion. What Americans can do right now to stay prepared no matter how this decision turns out. Staying prepared. What Americans should do right now. After breaking down the legal risks, economic impacts, and political uncertainty, the final question is not about Washington. It's about you. What should Americans actually do right now while waiting for the Supreme Court's decision and clarity on the $2,000 checks? The answer is preparation, not panic and not blind optimism. At this moment, tariffs are still in place. The court has not ruled, and the idea of a $2,000 rebate remains unresolved. That means the smartest approach is to plan your finances as if the check is not coming. If it does arrive one day, that's a positive surprise. But until then, daily reality doesn't change. Bills still arrive. Medications still need to be filled. Groceries and utilities still must be paid. For seniors and retirees, this mindset is especially important. Fixed incomes don't leave room for assumptions. Financial stability comes from planning based on confirmed income, not future promises. Here's what staying prepared looks like. Follow official updates, not rumors or speculation. Avoid making financial decisions based on unapproved programs. Keep emergency savings intact whenever possible. Focus on what you can control: budgeting, spending, and planning. Uncertainty creates stress. Understanding reduces it. No matter how the Supreme Court rules, clarity will eventually come. And when it does, Americans will adjust, as they always do. Until then, staying informed, cautious, and grounded is the strongest position you can take. Take care of your finances, take care of your health, and keep paying attention, because when real change happens, it won't come quietly.